Welcome to another day in Sodom. This video is the first video in a sub-series of videos which I've called The Time for Talking is Over. This is just a recognition that I think we have to recognise that when we're analysing what's been happening to Western culture since the 1960s, the left has completely taken over. And they're so dominant that there's now not even the fig leaf of any need for them to kind of intellectually justify their assertions. And in fact, which is what I call assertionism, that's what I call their belief system. They simply assert it and it's true. Now, there's not even the fig leaf. You are just simply dealing with something that's actually akin to a religion, a religious belief. In fact, I see left-wing ideology as what I call self-actualization or self-realization, that their ideas and their activities are really something akin to a religious cult. And indeed, some years ago, I wrote a book called In the Shadow of the Bomb, Politics, Religion and the Baby Boom Generation. And in that book, I put forward the thesis that the natural enemies of the left were not the conservative Republicans. That is, the left, I mean the new left of the 1960s, was not the conservative Republicans. It was actually the moral majority, which came into being in the 1980s. And which is to say Christian fundamentalists. And it just drives home the point that the real battleground is spiritual. It's called politics, but all of this is operating very much on the spiritual level, and we need to recognize it as such and fight these people on that basis, that we are really dealing with a search for meaning, the meaning of life, which many people find in this mentality of political activism. Now, when I say the time for talking is over, that's usually taken to be a ringing call to revolutionary action and, violent revolution and so on. But what I mean by this is simply it's time for conservatives to just understand that there's really no arguing with leftists. There's no point in treating these people as rational beings. And there's only a limited amount of use in analysing what's going on the intellectual level, which is what I do. But I think it's important that we understand these things. But really, I think the Trump election showed just how much conservative sentiment there is out there. And it's really just, it's a matter of confronting leftists as a malignant political force and doing what you can through the political process to stand up to them. It's pretty much impossible to argue against somebody whose philosophical view of the world is completely one of self-indulgence. Back in the 1960s, there was a Bob Dylan song which featured the lyrics, "There's something going on here, and you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones?" And this was all about the ineffability and the mystique of the youth movement, the youth protest movement, which incidentally, I might add, imposed its will in society, because we had the baby boom generation of young, energetic people who had no other kind of meaning they could find in their life except by expressing political activism. In fact, that's what I call uh, the leftism today. It's the a mentality of political activism is the substance of what they think about the world. And as you would expect, with this sort of philosophy of assertionism and political activism, um, it's almost impossible to argue against this self expression. And in fact, it's even got to a stage now where the way in which the left are silencing any sort of conservative voices or anybody who stands in the way of this freedom of expression, that it's now almost getting to the point. For example, I'll give you a good example here. Google fired James Dahmer um, for the crime of sexism, so called. And Google were promptly labelled by many conservatives gulag. But the point is that the left now sees itself as so beyond reproach that it's almost as if they're saying whatever the conservatives will say, they will say, "Oh yeah, that's right, we're evil." Yeah, well, anything you want us to be, because we're all we are doing is expressing ourselves, we're asserting ourselves, and we're just going to do and think whatever we please. The IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, has released a report recently, and they're in the news again for their pronouncements. This is actually a very good example of what I mean, because these climate alarmists have been continually implying that our inaction about climate change, so-called, is taking us to what they call the tipping point, where it's all over, we can't do anything, we'll just have to sit back and let it all happen. But they continually push this line of the tipping point is just out there. We never pass the tipping point. The tipping point is just a little bit out of reach. And thank goodness for us, because we can just keep on being politically activist about climate change. And I think, what is it? Is it that the goal is not important? It's just the journey. So it's so much fun to be an activist. It's so much fun to be a climate change activist. And they'll keep talking about the tipping point, and it's always going to be just out of reach, and we're never going to pass it because that would take away all the fun of being a political activist. With the continuing moral degeneration of our society, I find that the left is always ahead of me. For example, my clinching argument back in the day was, if you let homosexuals in the schools, they'll turn your kids into homosexuals, And people would say, nonsense, that will never happen. Now, with transgenderism studies, it is happening, but now it's nonsense. It doesn't matter that it's happening. And I wonder, where are the parents of Australia's school kids? Some years ago, there was an interview on TV with one of Australia's leading greenies, a man by the name of Bob Brown, and the interviewer was implying that this was back in the days of the financial crisis, and with this slowdown in the economy, at least that will sort of reduce carbon emissions. And this greeny politician, you could see the expression on his face. Just like, well, yes, but that would render us greenies irrelevant. We can't have that. So, Well, what a shame if we reduced our carbon emissions and the Greenies became irrelevant. Well, that's really pretty much my whole argument in a nutshell. Okay, well, that's all I have for today. Until next time, goodbye.